Welcome, seekers of mystery and dreamers of the unknown. Tonight, you are invited into a story woven with starlight, ancient whispers, and forgotten truths. Across deserts, oceans, and mountains, civilizations left behind monuments that align with the heavens, silent witnesses to a secret they once held. Were these only temples, or were they gates that opened to other realms, other stars? In this journey, you will hear of watchers who mapped the skies, of false gates that crumbled under pride, of custodians who veiled the truth, and of a liturgy that taught the world to breathe again in harmony with the cosmos. This is no simple tale, it is a mythic epic, a lullaby carved from legend, guiding you gently towards sleep while stirring your imagination with questions that have haunted humanity for thousands of years. Close your eyes, let the rhythm of the story carry you, and listen, perhaps tonight, the stars themselves will whisper their secret to you. In the dim mists of forgotten ages, before the first empires raised their banners and before the names of men were etched in stone, there were whispers of doors not made by mortal hands. They were not doors of wood nor gates of bronze, but circles of radiant stone, archways humming with a breath not of this world. The ancient chroniclers, those who carved symbols upon clay and chiseled signs upon obelisks, spoke of these portals as stargates, thresholds where the veil of the heavens brushed against the earth. The memory of such wonders lies buried in the ruins of the oldest lands, in Mesopotamia where rivers entwined like serpents, in the deserts of Chem where pyramids rose as frozen mountains of light, and in the sacred plains of Barat where hymns echoed with the cadence of eternity. To speak of these gates was to awaken echoes of dread and awe, for they were said to be bridges between worlds, paths where mortals might trespass into the dominion of the gods. Time has clothed these tales in the garments of myth, yet fragments endure. The priests of Sumer told of shining discs descending from the skies, guided not by sails or oars, but by fire that roared like the breath of dragons. From such chariots of flame emerged beings draped in radiance, who bore knowledge of the stars and the measures of the cosmos. They taught the first kings to rule, they bestowed upon the scribes the art of writing. And they whispered the hidden names of metals that slept beneath the mountains. But more wondrous still, they revealed gateways through which they themselves traveled, arcs of stone humming with unseen currents, alive as though the very pulse of the universe resided within their frames. The Egyptians, whose monuments still defy the centuries, spoke in their sacred texts of the Duat, the hidden realm where the gods sailed upon the river of night. Yet among their glyphs lingered depictions of ovals and rings, frames through which the divine bark might pass in an instant, bridging the worlds of earth and sky. In the hidden chambers beneath the pyramids, initiates whispered of doors that shine without flame, doors that led to the imperishable stars. In Bharat, the keepers of the Vedas sang of Vimanas, celestial chariots coursing the skies, and of yantras that bent the fabric of space. Within those hymns, obscured by the rhythm of chants, lies mention of dvaras, cosmic thresholds guarded by beings who dwelt neither fully in heaven nor fully on earth. The guardians stood as sentinels before radiant circles, and only those who carried the proper hymns in their souls might pass. Across the seas, in the temples of the Maya and the stones of the Inca, one finds symbols eerily akin, spirals, rings, and doorways carved upon the mountainside that seem to lead nowhere, yet resonate with a silence heavy as the abyss. Some of these carvings, when bathed in moonlight, give the illusion of depth, as if the rock itself were but a veil. The shamans, keepers of vision, claimed that such places were the mouths of the earth, where the breath of the gods seeped into the mortal world. What if these scattered fragments, borne across continents and centuries, are not mere echoes of imagination but records of a truth long concealed? What if the stargates, those silent sentinels of stone and light, once stood in plain sight of mankind, only to be hidden as the ages turned and the knowledge of the ancients sank beneath the waves of time? The first memory of such gates rises from Sumer, the black land between rivers. There, upon the tablets of Uruk, etched in cuneiform like the very bones of history, is the tale of a king who walked with gods. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, is said to have sought a passage beyond the world of men. Some claim he journeyed not by ship nor by foot, but through a gate carved in radiant stone, a threshold that shimmered as though woven from starlight. From that crossing, he beheld lands where suns never set and rivers glowed like molten gold. Whether allegory or memory, none may say, but the image lingers, carved into clay, carried by whispers across the ages. The priests of Babylon, inheritors of Sumer's wisdom, guarded their ziggurats as if they were stairways to heaven itself. Yet beneath those layered towers, in the sealed chambers where only kings and priests dared walk, there were said to be devices wrought of strange stone and metal. They were not altars, nor thrones, but rings half buried in the ground, etched with symbols that echoed the constellations. When the rites were spoken and the fires lit, a glow like liquid moonlight filled the frame, and the air trembled as though reality itself were drawn taut. Egypt, too, held its mysteries. Upon the walls of Dendera and Abydos are carvings whose meaning eludes the learned, shapes like vessels of light, arcs like the jaws of serpents devouring the sky. Some of the oldest papyri speak of the gates of Ra, luminous thresholds by which the sun god journeyed from the east to the west each day, not by crossing the sky but by passing through hidden doors in the fabric of being. The pyramids, aligned with the stars, may themselves be markers, monuments that point to these celestial passages, anchoring them to the earth. In Bharat's Vedic hymns, the language of the ancients cloaks truth in poetry. The fire god Agni is praised as the mouth of the gods, the one who carries offerings through unseen doors. The hymns speak of 7 rivers of light, 7 steps of passage, 7 gates of the universe. Some scholars read this as mere symbolism, yet when one ponders the yantras, geometries inscribed with cosmic precision, it is tempting to imagine that they were not mere meditations but blueprints of machines, designs for gateways through which the soul, and perhaps the body, might travel. Even the distant isles of Polynesia tell of shining paths in the sea and the sky, of stone circles where the gods descended in pillars of light. The navigators of the vast ocean, guided by stars alone, may have remembered more than currents and winds. Perhaps their chants were maps of passages not of water but of the very heavens. And so, across the tapestry of the world, scattered fragments whisper of one truth: there were gates, and they were not of this earth, yet as centuries rolled into millennia, the gates were hidden. Some say they were sealed by the gods themselves, lest mortals trespass too far. Others claim they were buried beneath mountains, drowned beneath seas, or veiled in the deserts where no man dares wander. A few whisper that they yet remain, hidden in plain sight, their frames cloaked by time, awaiting the day when once more they shall awaken, but even in silence, they left their mark. The myths of golden ages, of paradises beyond the horizon, of gods who came and went in radiant chariots, all these are but shadows cast by the gates upon the memory of mankind. To walk through a stargate was to step into the realm of the divine, to taste the eternity of the cosmos. And so the memory endures, woven into lullabies, carved into stone, sung in hymns, and whispered in secret rites. Thus begins the tale of the stargates, not as inventions of fancy, but as legacies of a forgotten age, when earth and sky were bridged by circles of stone and light. The path is long, the mystery deep, and the echoes of that age call still from beneath the sands of time. The centuries deepened into ages, and the songs of the ancients grew faint, like echoes lost in a cavern. Yet though kingdoms rose and fell, the image of the gates endured, always half remembered, always half forbidden. What mortal eye had once seen with clarity became wrapped in veils of allegory, guarded by priests, cloaked in riddles. The farther mankind drifted from the primordial dawn, the more carefully the memory of the gates was hidden. Among the guardians of this knowledge were not only priests and kings but entire orders sworn to secrecy. They knew that the gates were not simple ornaments of myth but vessels of terrible power, conduits through which gods or strangers from the abyss of stars might pass. To misuse such thresholds was to invite ruin, for the passage between worlds was not a gentle road but a tearing of the veil, a shudder in the balance of earth and sky. Thus the watchers took their oath: better to conceal the gates, better to bury the knowledge, than to see the arrogance of men unravel the harmony of creation. It is said that after the flood, the great deluge remembered in Sumer, in the Ark of Noah, in the epics of India and the chants of Mesoamerica, the gates were sealed. Whether by divine hand or mortal cunning none may know. Some chronicles hint that the very flood itself was no accident, but the result of gates torn open without measure, unleashing torrents of fire and water. The survivors, few and trembling, bore within them the last fragments of memory, which in time crystallized into myth. And so the gates fell silent, yet their husks remained, stone circles in the desert, doorways carved into mountains, hidden chambers beneath the earth. The ancient scribes of Egypt wrote of the hidden places of the Duat, where Osiris judged the dead. To pass into that realm, one required the knowledge of sacred words. Passwords given at each gate. Each threshold was guarded by serpents of fire and beings with heads of falcons or jackals, who tested the soul's worth. These were not mere fables of the afterlife, but veiled memories of the sealed passages. For only by the proper words, the harmonies of sound and symbol, could the gates be stirred from slumber. In the east, the Upanishads whispered of the Antariksh, the in-between realm, neither earth nor sky, but the path between. The yogis, seeking liberation, spoke of subtle gates within the body, chakras aligned like stars. Yet beyond metaphor, there lingered the hint of cosmic thresholds, of doors of Brahman through which the soul might pass to realms beyond comprehension. Was the inner journey but a reflection of the outer? Were the diagrams of the mystics but shadows of machines that once gleamed in forgotten sanctuaries? The Andes, too, hold their secrets. Near Lake Titicaca stands the Puerta de Huaymarca, the Gate of the Gods. A vast doorway carved into living rock, it opens onto nothing but stone. Yet local lore tells of priests who vanished into its frame, carrying golden discs that shone like suns. They spoke of a portal leading not into death but into another world, a realm where the children of the stars awaited. The Spanish chroniclers dismissed such tales as native fancy, yet the stone doorway endures, silent, immovable, waiting. In Mesoamerica, the Maya inscribed their codices with glyphs of serpents swallowing stars, of rings and tunnels through which suns and moons might pass. Their calendar, precise as the clockwork of the cosmos, was said to mark not only the rhythm of days but the opening and closing of cosmic doors. At the end of cycles, when worlds were reborn, the gates would stir. To the Maya, the universe itself was a great breathing entity, inhaling and exhaling worlds through unseen thresholds. Europe, though cloaked in later histories, remembers too. Stonehenge rises from the plains of Albion, its great lintels aligned with the solstices. Scholars call it a temple of the sun, yet its true design echoes the circle, the eternal form of the gate. Beneath the stones lie burials, sacrifices, offerings, all to appease the forces that lingered there. Across the sea, the myths of the Norse told of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that linked Midgard to Asgard. A shimmering arch across the heavens, it was both road and gate, guarded by Heimdall, who ever watched. Though the sagas speak in poetry, the pattern is the same, thresholds of light, guarded by sentinels, connecting mortal and divine. Thus the gates were remembered across the world, not as inventions of fancy but as remnants of truth shrouded in time. Yet if they were sealed, who sealed them? And why? Some say it was the gods, fearing that mankind's hunger for power would breach the boundaries of creation. Others say it was men themselves, priests who witnessed the ruin that followed unmeasured passage, who vowed never again to let such doors stand open. Still others whisper of a war in the heavens, a conflict between those who came through the gates, their battles shattering mountains and scarring the skies. When the victors departed, they left the gates closed, and their secrets buried, but silence is not death. The gates, though sealed, remain. They sleep beneath the sands of Egypt, beneath the jungles of the Yucatan, beneath the snows of Siberia and the basalt of forgotten isles. The earth herself cradles them, as if protecting her children from knowledge too vast to bear. Yet every so often, one stirs. There are tales from the Middle Ages of travelers stumbling upon circles of light in the forests, of monks who vanished within church walls and were never seen again, of lights in the sky that descended upon stone rings long forgotten. In the Chronicles of Ireland, fairy mounds are said to open on midsummer nights, revealing halls of wonder beyond the mortal world. The folk called them the homes of the city, yet their description is not unlike that of the ancient gates, radiant thresholds, guarded, capricious, leading to realms where time flows differently. In Persia, the mystic spoke of the Simurgh, the bird who dwelt upon the cosmic tree, who guided seekers to the hidden city beyond mountains of fire. Those who reached its gate never returned, save in dreams and visions, speaking of gardens eternal and rivers of light. In such visions, one glimpses the lingering memory of passage, through threshold, into otherworld. The guardians of this knowledge were scattered across the earth, their names forgotten, their symbols half buried. Yet they endured, passing secrets through symbols, through numbers, through alignments of stone and star. They waited, not for the return of gods, but for the readiness of mankind. For they knew the gates could not remain sealed forever, and so, throughout the long march of centuries, mankind carried within its myths the faint glow of truth, that there are doors hidden in the world. And that beyond them lies not death, but transformation. The gates are not mere stone nor mere myth, but wounds in the fabric of being, wounds that heal, yet never vanish. When the stars align, when the rites are spoken, when the time is ripe, they may open once more. And when they do, mankind shall stand again before the silent arches, trembling as their forefathers trembled, gazing into the unknown. Thus the legend deepens, from the dawn of the first cities to the hush of medieval cloisters, always whispering, always waiting. The gates are sealed, but they are not gone. When the first cartographers of the sky raised their gaze upward, they were not merely stargazers but inheritors of a secret far older than their craft. For the constellations, those vast figures traced in fire, were more than tales of hunters, lions, and serpents. They were maps, keys to thresholds hidden across the earth. The gates, bound to heaven by laws unknown to men, opened not at random, but when the firmament itself aligned. To the ancients, astronomy was not only a study of cycles, but a sacred art of navigation. For the stars revealed the moments when the earth would tremble and the gates stir from slumber. The Sumerians named the wandering lights in the sky as gods, each carrying dominion over fate and time. Yet upon the oldest tablets one finds not only names but numbers, calculations too precise to be idle record. They knew of the precession of the heavens, of cycles so vast that modern minds can scarcely fathom them. Why should such knowledge have been pressed into clay at the dawn of civilization? Perhaps because it was not discovery, but inheritance. The builders of Uruk, Kish, and Nippur may have received from elder hands the keys to the heavens, told which stars must be watched, which conjunctions marked the moments when the invisible doors would swing wide. In Egypt, the ceilings of temples glitter still with stars painted in blue and gold. The goddess Nut arches her body over the earth, swallowing the sun each night and birthing it anew each dawn. Yet among these celestial scenes lie diagrams of precision, the Dendera zodiac, circles etched with symbols of the stars. Beneath myth, geometry whispers. Each sign may have been an instruction, a marker of time when the breath of the cosmos and the earth's own pulse intertwined, stirring the thresholds that slumbered in silence. The pyramids themselves, aligned to Orion and Sirius, stand not only as tombs but as monuments pointing toward the cycles when the hidden doors of Ra would blaze again with light. Far to the east, in the sacred land of Bharat, the astronomers of Vedic lore recorded cycles of yugas, ages so vast they dwarf empires and eras. Within these cycles, they inscribed positions of planets, eclipses, and the nodal points of the moon. Some claimed the gods themselves moved through the nakshatras, the lunar mansions, passing from star to star through doors invisible to mortal eyes. The Surya Siddhanta, among the oldest treatises of the stars, speaks of distances and measures so uncannily precise that scholars puzzle how such knowledge came to be. Could it be that such numbers were fragments of a greater whole, once used to chart the moments when heaven's rhythm unlocked the gates? The Mayan calendar, so precise it traced the turning of Venus to the day, carried more than the reckoning of seasons. The end of cycles, the Bacton, the Khatun, was not merely the passage of time but the death and rebirth of worlds. At each cycle's turning, shamans gathered in temples carved with serpents and jaguars, awaiting the signs when the gates between worlds thinned. Their glyphs spoke of the road of Xibalba, the dark corridor beneath the earth, and of lords who passed through portals of flame to judge the living. These were not only myths of death but memories of thresholds stirred by the dance of planets, opening briefly as time's will completed its turn, even in the Isles of Greece. The philosophers who peered at the heavens carried fragments of this knowledge. Plato spoke of the great year, the vast cycle when stars return to their original places, and of Atlantis, a lost realm destroyed when its guardians misused powers given from beyond. The Pythagoreans, keepers of number, spoke of harmony not only in music but in the cosmos, and hinted that number itself was the language by which gates might be called awake. For if the universe is a song, then the thresholds are but instruments, vibrating when struck by the right chord of heaven and earth. And yet, not only the heavens but the earth itself was a map. The ancients raised their monuments not in randomness but in geometry that spanned continents. From Giza to Teotihuacan, from Stonehenge to the Angkor Plain, patterns emerge, alignments that trace lines across the globe as if the earth itself were a vast yantra, a wheel of power. Some claim these alignments mark the veins of the planet, channels of unseen force that converge where gates once stood. To the untrained eye, the temples are scattered, yet from the sky they form a web, a network as though designed to echo the constellations above. As above, so below, whispered the Hermetic sages, and in that phrase lies the key: the heavens were not separate from the gates. But their guide, legends across continents tell of beings who descended to teach men the measures of the stars. In Mesopotamia they were the Apkallu, sages who rose from the deep. In Egypt they were the Shemsuhor, the followers of Horus, who ruled before dynasties began. In Mesoamerica they were Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who gave men knowledge of number and time. In every land, the pattern is the same: wisdom came not as invention but as a gift, given that men might know when the doors would open, and how to approach them with reverence, but reverence faded. As empires hardened into kingdoms and kingdoms into nations, the sacred maps became trophies of power. Priests guarded their calendars not for wisdom but for dominion. Kings sought to time their wars by omens of the sky, and the harmony between heaven and earth grew dim. Yet the gates endured, though rarely stirred. Perhaps the stars themselves withdrew their blessing, or perhaps the watchers chose silence, fearing that mankind's pride would lead again to ruin. Still, whispers of awakenings endure. There are tales of lights over Giza when Sirius rose in the east, of temples in Angkor where doorways shone on equinox dawns, of shamans in the Amazon who drank bitter brews and claimed to walk through luminous arches into other realms. Could it be that, even as the ages buried their memory, the gates never truly ceased, but flickered still when heaven and earth embraced in perfect measure? The Middle Ages, with their cloisters and cathedrals, were not free of this mystery. Gothic spires pointed heavenward, their rose windows shaped as wheels of light, echoing the sun and the stars. In the secret geometries of these cathedrals, some see more than worship, they see codes. Alignments to solstices and equinoxes, numbers woven into stone as reminders of cosmic law. Perhaps those who built them, inheritors of hidden lore, sought to keep alive the memory of gates, veiled now in Christian vestments but still echoing the old truth. Even the wandering mystics of Islam, the Sufis, sang of the Barzakh, the isthmus between worlds, a place of vision where heaven and earth touched. Their poetry spoke of doors within doors, of veils lifted one by one, until the soul stood at a threshold of light. To cross was to step beyond the visible into the eternal, a passage not unlike the stargates of ancient days, and thus the pattern emerges, across time and land, heaven's map to earth. Temples aligned with stars, cycles tracked with precision beyond measure. All for one purpose, to know when and where the gates might stir. For though they were sealed, they were not destroyed. They slumber, and the stars themselves are their key. Beneath the woven tapestry of myths, there lingers the shadow of hands unknown, the hands that raised the gates, aligned the temples, and etched the sky upon the earth. Who were they, these builders of the first thresholds? Were they men, divinely inspired, or strangers from beyond the stars, who passed their craft into mortal keeping? The legends call them by many names: gods, watchers, shining ones, teachers of men. Yet behind the veils of poetry, their image persists, beings who came not from neighboring valleys but from beyond the horizon of the world itself. In the clay tablets of Sumer, the Apkallu rise from the waters, half fish, half men, bearers of wisdom and law. They taught the arts of writing, of agriculture, of cities. Yet in their gift was also the knowledge of the stars, and of the gates by which they themselves had come. To the Sumerians, they were not myths but ancestors of kings, their images carved upon palace walls to guard the people. The very word Apkallu means great sage, but their presence, radiant and strange, hints at origins beyond Earth's familiar soil. In Egypt, the Shemsuhor, the followers of Horus, ruled in ages before the first dynasties. Their reign is measured not in decades but in centuries, even millennia, according to the ancient king lists. They came from the land of the gods, bearing the emblem of the falcon, watchers of the skies. It was they, the texts suggest, who aligned the monuments, who anchored the great pyramids to Orion, who traced in stone the eternal map of heaven's law. When their reign ended, the pharaohs inherited their symbols but not their wisdom, and the gates sank into silence. In Bharat, the Vedas speak of the Devas, radiant ones who dwelt in realms beyond sight, descending in chariots of light. They were opposed by the Asuras, beings of equal power, who sought dominion through other thresholds. Between them raged a war not of swords but of cosmic forces, battles fought in the skies and in realms where time itself flowed strangely. The echoes of those wars linger still in the hymns, half remembered, yet their detail suggests more than allegory. Some say these were not divine abstractions but rival travelers through the gates, their conflicts scarring the memory of mankind. Across the seas, the Maya told of Kukul Khan, the feathered serpent, who descended to teach men number, time, and law. He departed through a gateway of flame, promising to return when the cycles turned anew. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, who emerged from Lake Titicaca, radiant as the sun, to shape the world and teach mankind. He too vanished, not by ship nor by foot, but by walking into the horizon as if the air itself parted before him. These beings, whether gods or teachers, left behind not only temples but stories of thresholds crossed. The Polynesians tell of Tangaroa, who descended in canoes of light, and of stone circles where he stepped between realms. The Dogon of Africa speak of Namo, beings from the star Sirius, who came through watery gateways to bring knowledge of the heavens. How is it that across lands divided by oceans, the same pattern appears, beings who came from the stars, who opened gates, who departed again with promise of return? Perhaps they were not gods, as later ages deified them, but a people whose mastery of the gates allowed them to walk between worlds as men walk between villages. To those who first beheld them, radiant and strange, their knowledge seemed divine. Yet their legacy lies not only in myths but in stone, in numbers, in the unexplainable precision of ancient works. Consider the Great Pyramids, their stones cut with accuracy beyond explanation, their alignment with Orion flawless. To this day, the method by which they were raised eludes certainty. Or Stonehenge, whose megaliths, weighing many tons, stand in precise relation to solstices, as if they were not merely altars but instruments of cosmic measurement. Or Teotihuacan, laid out as a mirror of the heavens, the avenue of the dead aligned to the Pleiades. Were these monuments not temples to gods, but anchors of gates, aligned to the stars by those who knew the paths between realms? Even in later ages, the echo of the builders persisted. The Greeks remembered the Titans, mighty beings who walked the earth before men, who were cast down but not forgotten. The Norse sang of the Vanir and the Aesir, gods at war whose battles shook the cosmos. Each culture, in its own tongue, preserved fragments of memory, fragments pointing to one truth: the builders were not of mortal kind, and yet, their presence was not eternal. In every tale, they vanish. Some return to the stars, some retreat into hidden realms, some pass through gates never to be seen again. Why? Perhaps because the gates were closing, or perhaps because their task was done. They came to plant seeds of knowledge, to awaken the first civilizations, to leave behind maps of heaven and earth. Then, as the cycles turned, they departed, entrusting their legacy to the frail hands of men. But their departure was not without struggle. Some myths speak of betrayal, of wars among the shining ones, of gates misused for conquest. In the Mahabharata, the wars of gods are described with fire that scorched the earth, with weapons that lit the sky brighter than 1,000 suns. In Sumer, tales tell of Enlil who sought to destroy mankind with flood, while Enki preserved them, guiding the ark through chaos. In Greece, the War of the Titans was said to have torn heaven from earth. These may not be mere metaphors, but memories of conflicts fought through the gates, battles whose scars linger still in legend, yet even in their absence, the builders left guardians. Orders of priests. Brotherhoods of sages, lineages sworn to protect fragments of their knowledge. In Egypt, the priesthood of Heliopolis guarded the secrets of Ra's passage. In Mesopotamia, the Magi preserved the calculations of the heavens. In India, the rishis and yogis encoded cosmic law into chants and diagrams. In Europe, the Druids traced circles of stone, preserving memory in symbol when language failed. Each lineage, scattered yet united, kept alive the whisper, the gates remain, and the builders shall return when the stars decree. The question lingers, were the builders gods, travelers, or something beyond both? To the ancients, the distinction mattered little. They were the shining ones, bringers of knowledge, masters of passage. To call them divine was but to recognize their otherness, their distance from mortal toil. Yet perhaps they were simply older than us, wiser than us, walking paths we have forgotten. The legacy of the builders is carved not only in stone, but in the human heart. The yearning for the beyond, the hunger for the infinite, the dream of stepping through a door and finding worlds without end, all these are seeds planted by their hands. And though their gates lie sealed, though their temples crumble, though their names fade, the yearning endures. For mankind has always been a traveler, restless, never content with the horizon. The builders merely showed the way, and the gates were their gift, now hidden, now lost, but never destroyed. Thus, as the ages turn, the memory of the hidden builders endures, whispering that mankind is not alone, that the gates are real, and that one day, when the stars align, the silent arches shall blaze again, and the legacy of the builders shall awaken. As the ages rolled onward, the voices of the ancients fell quiet, and the luminous gates that once pulsed with power sank into stillness. What was once spoken openly as the path of gods became clothed in allegory, then hidden in ritual, and at last dismissed as superstition. This silence was no accident of time, but a deliberate veiling, woven into the very fabric of history. For the guardians who remained, those who had glimpsed or inherited fragments of the truth, chose secrecy above revelation, concealment above proclamation. The chronicles of the classical world hint at this veil. The Greeks, who inherited fragments of Egyptian wisdom, spoke of mysteries reserved only for the initiated. In Eleusis, initiates walked in darkness through underground halls, hearing chants that echoed the birth and death of gods. Yet beneath the drama of Demeter and Persephone, there may have lingered a deeper remembrance, that doors between worlds do not close forever, but swing open with the turning of the cosmic cycle. The uninitiated heard only myth, the few who passed through the rites perhaps learned whispers of something far older. Rome, inheriting Greece, veiled the knowledge still further. Temples rose to Jupiter and Saturn, to Apollo and Mithras, each containing rites of secrecy. The Mithraic mysteries in particular spoke of the seven spheres, of ascent through hidden gates guarded by cosmic beings. To the soldier who knelt within its shadowed halls, these were teachings of the soul's journey after death. Yet perhaps the journey described was not only metaphor, but memory of real thresholds that once trembled with starlight, doors aligned with the wanderings of planets. When Rome fell and the Middle Ages drew their cloak of shadow across Europe, much was lost. Libraries burned, temples crumbled, and the wisdom of the ancients sank beneath the tide of time. Yet the gates were not forgotten. Their memory lingered in monasteries, cloaked in parable, and in the hidden lore of hermits who read the heavens by candlelight. The alchemists, heirs of a fractured science, spoke of portals of transformation, where matter itself might pass from one state to another. Though the language of metals veiled their words, one may hear in them the faint echo of the gates, thresholds of matter and spirit alike. The silence deepened further still in lands beyond Christendom. In the deserts of Arabia, wanderers told of ruins swallowed by sand, where circles of stone shimmered faintly in the heat. In Persia, poets cloaked cosmic truths in allegory, singing of beloveds veiled and unveiled, of gardens hidden beyond walls of light. The Sufis spoke of maqamat, stations of ascent, doors passed through by the soul on its journey to the eternal. To the mystic, these were inner truths, yet within them may rest veiled fragments of an outer reality once known, that to cross the veil was not imagination but remembrance. In India, too, the gates grew silent. The yugas turned, and with each age, the brightness of memory dimmed. Yet the yogis still whispered of cities, powers of movement through realms, and of subtle thresholds that could be crossed by the awakened. Temples bore yantras inscribed in stone, cosmic diagrams pointing to alignments of earth and heaven. The rituals continued, but the direct knowledge of the gates passed into symbol, awaiting rediscovery by seekers in later ages. In the New World, untouched by Europe until centuries later, the silence took another form. The Maya, who had once mapped the cycles of Venus and the turning of the heavens, saw their cities fall into ruin. Their calendars endured, carved into stone, yet the keepers of their lore vanished into jungle and memory. The Incas, whose tales spoke of gods who vanished into mountains, kept sacred stones where gates were once said to shimmer. But when the conquistadors came, fire and sword silenced their voices, and the gates were veiled behind conquest and ruin. The great silence was thus not a single act, but a weaving across the globe. Knowledge was buried in ritual, in symbol, in allegory. The stars themselves remained unchanged, but men no longer read them as keys to doors. The gates themselves, if they stirred, did so unseen, their glow masked by the blindness of those who no longer remembered. Yet silence is never complete. Across the centuries, faint echoes endured. Pilgrims told of sudden lights in lonely valleys, of caves where a strange wind blew though no opening was seen. Sailors spoke of islands that vanished when approached, of doors in cliffs that shimmered like water, of companions lost to strange horizons. In monasteries, scribes wrote of visions, of saints lifted into other realms by radiant arches. In every century, fragments broke the silence, though never enough to awaken the world. Some few dared to seek more openly. In the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the texts of Greece and Rome, whispers of cosmic doors returned. Scholars pored over Hermetic scrolls, seeking the wisdom of Thoth, who was said to walk between heaven and earth. Secret societies formed, binding their initiates by oath, preserving knowledge in symbols, the circle, the triangle, the eye. These were not idle inventions, but echoes of a deeper memory, preserved through signs when words would fail. The great silence endured for millennia. And yet, the very persistence of memory across such silence is itself proof of the gate's reality. For what myth endures so universally, across continents and centuries? Unless it bears the weight of truth. Myths of floods, of fiery chariots, of shining beings, of doors between worlds, these are not inventions scattered at random, but refracted light from a single hidden flame. Thus, while the world forgot, the flame did not die. It smoldered in temples and cloisters, in carvings and chants, in visions of mystics and in the restless hunger of mankind for what lies beyond. The great silence was but a veil, stretched across the ages, thin enough that the attentive might glimpse the light beyond. The gates had not ceased to exist. They had only withdrawn, waiting for the time appointed. For silence is not the end, but the pause before the song resumes. And one day, when the veil of time grows thin again, the sealed arches shall awaken, and the great silence shall break. As the long silence stretched across centuries, the guardians of the old ways scattered like seeds upon the wind. Their temples crumbled, their rites were outlawed, their voices hushed, yet still they endured. Not in kingdoms nor in crowns, but in whispers and fragments, in brotherhoods hidden from the eye of kings, in scrolls tucked beneath cloisters, in symbols carved discreetly into stone. These were the watchers, not gods, nor rulers, but men and women who carried the memory of the gates as a sacred trust. In every age they bore different names. In Mesopotamia they were the last magi, keepers of starlight. In Egypt they hid among the priesthood, veiling their secrets beneath the rites of Osiris. In Greece they clothed themselves in the mysteries, teaching shadows of truths once bright. In India they dwelt as wandering yogis, chanting mantras whose syllables were keys of resonance. In Europe they became the alchemists, shaping their language in metals and fire to mask what they truly guarded. They did not possess the gates themselves, for the great arches slept in silence. But they bore fragments, symbols, chants, measures, alignments, pieces of a greater whole, like shards of a mirror reflecting a forgotten light. And though they could not stir the gates, they preserved enough to ensure that the knowledge would not perish utterly. In their hands lay the maps of the earth, drawn not only with mountains and rivers but with alignments of stone circles, pyramids, temples, and sacred wells. These maps revealed not the lands of men but the lines of power, the veins of the earth, the places where the hidden thresholds might one day awaken. For the gates were not scattered at random, but anchored at points where earth and sky converged, where the currents of unseen forces met in harmony. The watchers guarded these places, not with armies but with silence, lest the ignorant profane them. Yet even silence is fragile. Empires hungered for power, kings demanded dominion, and seekers burned with ambition. Again and again, men sought the secrets of the watchers, hoping to bend heaven's laws to their will. Some pried open fragments of truth, but without the harmony of the whole, their efforts ended in ruin. Legends tell of towers that fell from the sky, of fire from heaven consuming cities, of voices of wrath thundering from the void. These are not merely myths of divine punishment, but warnings of what occurs when thresholds are torn open by unworthy hands. The Tower of Babel is such a tale. Men, united in one tongue, sought to build a stairway to heaven itself. Yet what if the tower was no mere structure of stone, but an attempt to rebuild a gate, a threshold to breach the stars? The tale tells that the Lord scattered their tongues and cast down their work. But perhaps it was not only tongues that were scattered, but fragments of knowledge itself, broken so that no one people might again hold the whole. Thus the watchers carried pieces into every land, fragments veiled in culture and language, each incomplete without the others. In the East, the watchers preserved the sacred syllables, sounds of resonance that matched the vibration of heaven. In the West, they guarded the geometry, the patterns by which stone might mirror the stars. In the South, they preserved the cycles of time, the calendars of sun and moon. And in the North, they kept the symbols, the runes and knots that bound the fragments together. No one path was whole, yet together they hinted at the truth, that the gates awaited the time when the fragments would once more be woven into unity. Some among the watchers believed the gates would never awaken again, that their task was only to guard memory, to honor the past but not to expect the future. Others believed the silence was temporary, that in some distant age mankind would be ready, and the gates would blaze again with light. These latter ones guarded their fragments not only with secrecy but with hope, writing their symbols in places they believed would endure, carved upon mountains, hidden beneath cathedrals, etched into desert stone, inscribed in manuscripts passed hand to hand through centuries. In time, the world forgot the watchers. To most, they were but magicians, ascetics, dreamers, or fools. Their fragments seemed like riddles or fantasies. Their warnings like superstition. Yet across the globe, unconnected, divided by seas and tongues, the same symbols reappeared. The circle. The serpent devouring its tail. The star of 7 points. The spiral. The arch. Always the same forms, repeating through cultures who had no knowledge of one another. Coincidence, say the scholars. But the watchers knew, these were the fragments of the gates, preserved across the ages. Even the cathedrals of Europe, raised by masons who traced their craft back to hidden orders, carried these symbols. Rose windows gleamed with cosmic wheels, floors were patterned with labyrinths that mirrored the journey through thresholds. The very stones whispered secrets, though few could hear. The builders knew only in part, but enough to preserve the fragments until a future age. In the East, mandalas and yantras mirrored the same geometry, circles within squares, stars within circles, patterns too precise to be idle art. In the Americas, spirals carved into cliff walls echoed the same design, aligned with solstices, marking when heaven touched earth. In the islands of the Pacific, standing stones traced circles that mirrored the constellations. Everywhere, the same forms reappeared, like stars reflected in 1,000 rivers. Thus the watchers endured, not as rulers, but as guardians of memory. They kept the silence, they bore the fragments, they watched the stars. Their hope was not for their own time, but for the turning of ages, when mankind would rise again to the threshold, no longer as trembling children but as seekers ready to step through with reverence, for they believed the silence was not the end. It was the waiting. And one day, when the fragments are gathered, when the cycles align, when the voice of the stars calls once more, the gates will awaken. And the watchers, though long gone, will be vindicated, their fragments coalescing into the whole truth they preserved with such devotion, though the gates lay sealed and the watchers bore only fragments of their memory. The rhythm of the cosmos did not falter. The stars continued their slow procession, the earth turned upon its axis, the heavens breathed in cycles so vast that men could scarcely comprehend their span. And within these cycles lay a law, silent, inexorable, that bound the gates to time itself. For the thresholds were not mere monuments of stone but instruments woven into the harmony of heaven and earth, opening when the measure was full and closing when the rhythm demanded. Thus, across the long ages of silence, there were moments when the veils thinned, when light seeped through cracks in the hidden arches, when men glimpsed, for a breath, the forgotten truth. These moments, rare and brief, were remembered not as history but as catastrophe, for mankind was never prepared to receive them. The flood is the first and greatest of these tales, carried by every people across the world. In Mesopotamia it was the wrath of Enlil, in the Bible the judgment of God, in India the blessing of Manu's ark, in the Americas the cleansing waters that ended the first world. But perhaps beneath the flood lies another truth, that a gate, torn open before its time, unloosed powers too vast for earth to bear. The waters came not merely as punishment, but as consequence, as the balance of heaven and earth was broken. The world was cleansed, and the gates sealed again, their misuse buried beneath myth. Later ages remember fire. The Greeks told of Phaeton, who seized the chariot of the sun and scorched the earth until Zeus struck him down. The Hindus tell of celestial weapons loosed in wars between gods, fire brighter than 1,000 suns falling upon cities. The Norse spoke of Ragnarok, when the sky would split and flames consume the world. These too may be memories not of fable but of cycles when gates stirred unbidden, when men or gods sought to wield their power, and the result was ruin. Fire, flood, and darkness are the recurring motifs of these awakenings, for when the thresholds open out of harmony, they do not bring blessing but devastation. Even in later history, echoes remain. In the deserts of Sinai, pillars of flame are said to have descended, guiding a people through wilderness. In the highlands of Peru, there are stories of suns that fell to earth, of lights that scorched valleys, of doorways that blazed for a single night before vanishing. In Siberia, the earth trembled as forests fell in silence, and witnesses spoke of fire from the sky that left no crater, as though the air itself had been torn open. Scholars call it comet, meteor, explosion, but the myths of the Tungus people speak of the gods who opened a door and let their power spill upon the land. Each culture recalls in its own way the same pattern, that when the heavens align and men are unready, the gates stir, and the result is terror. And yet, when the heavens align and men are prepared, the gates may bring not ruin but renewal, for the cycles are not only of catastrophe but of awakening. The Golden Ages remembered in myth, the Satya Yuga of India, the time of the gods in Egypt, the first son of the Maya, were said to be ages when heaven and earth walked together, when knowledge flowed freely, when the gates stood open in harmony. These were times when men lived long, when wisdom flourished, when gods dwelt openly among them. But each golden age ended in fall, for the cycles turn. And what is given must one day be withdrawn. The watchers, in their fragments, preserved not only warnings but promises, that one day the cycles would turn again, that after silence and shadow would come awakening. They marked the stars, they calculated the ages, they inscribed upon stone the rhythms of the cosmos, so that future generations might know the appointed times. In their chants they spoke of great years, in their symbols they hinted at alignments yet to come. Always the message was the same, that the gates are not gone, but sleeping, and that they will awaken when the stars decree, but herein lies the peril. For when the cycles turn, mankind may face the gates once more. If prepared, if reverent, the crossing may bring renewal, wisdom, and unity. If unprepared, if arrogant, it may bring fire and flood once more. The gates are not benevolent nor malevolent, they are mirrors of man's own readiness. As above, so below. What is within will be magnified without. The ancients knew this, and so they veiled their knowledge not in fear but in caution. Better that the unworthy forget than that they tear open doors unfit for their hands. Better silence than catastrophe. And so they kept their fragments hidden, waiting for a time when mankind might awaken not only in mind but in spirit, yet even in their silence, the gates whisper. The turning of stars, the trembling of earth, the strange lights in the sky, all are reminders that the thresholds are not dead but slumbering. In times of great change, when empires fall and new ages dawn, they stir, as if the very birth and death of civilizations are bound to their rhythm. Perhaps mankind itself is the cycle, rising and falling with the opening and closing of doors beyond the world. Thus history is not a straight line but a wheel, turning endlessly, awakening, fall, silence, awakening again. And at the heart of that will lie the gates, eternal, patient, awaiting the alignment when once more they shall blaze with light. The fragments of myth, scattered yet united in pattern, all point to this truth, that mankind has not seen the last of the stargates. For the cycles are eternal, and silence is but the shadow that precedes the dawn. The silence of the ages did not erase the gates, for stone does not forget, and the earth guards what men neglect. Though their light faded, their frames endured. Buried in deserts, veiled by jungle, drowned beneath seas, and hidden beneath mountains. The world itself became their shroud, as though the planet, like a mother, concealed her dangerous treasures until her children were grown enough to hold them without fear. In the sands of Egypt, long after the reign of pharaohs, whispers spoke of corridors beneath the Sphinx, chambers cut deep into bedrock where the records of the first time were sealed. These chambers, though sought by kings, priests, and modern seekers alike, remained elusive. Some say within lies not gold nor papyrus but a silent ring of stone, veined with forgotten symbols, its surface dulled by centuries but still humming faintly in the stillness of the deep. The Sphinx, gazing eternally at the rising sun, may be not merely guardian of dynasties but sentinel of a gate that has not stirred since the first time. Far across the seas, in the highlands of Peru, the Puerta de Huaymarca rests as a doorway carved into living rock. Massive and solitary. To the passerby it is but a niche, a strange window hewn from stone. But to the keepers of the Andean myths, it is no mere carving but a threshold. They tell of a priest who once approached with a golden disc, which he pressed into the hollow at its heart. At once, the stone shimmered like water, and he passed through, vanishing from this world. The disc was said to be a key, forged by the gods themselves, a fragment of power that could awaken the sleeping gate. Whether truth or myth, the doorway remains, vast and silent, as if waiting for the return of its key. Beneath the jungles of Mesoamerica lie the ruins of cities swallowed by vines, their temples collapsed, their stones overgrown. Yet within their hidden chambers are carvings of serpents circling portals, of lords stepping into rings of fire. Some tombs bear lids etched with figures ascending through stairways of flame, their bodies tilted as though falling into the sky. Scholars call them symbols of the afterlife, but the imagery is too precise, too resonant with tales across oceans. Perhaps the kings of the Maya and Olmec did not merely await paradise in death, but sought to step through the gates themselves, bearing with them offerings for the journey, in the frozen vastness of Siberia. Where forests stretch beyond sight, there are places where stones rise in circles, half buried by snow. The nomads speak of fires that sometimes dance there without fuel, of shadows that move though no figure is present. They avoid such places, calling them the sleeping mouths of the world. When asked, they tell of ancestors who vanished into glowing arches, never to return. The memory endures in fragments, a glow, a sound like thunder, a vanishing. No monuments mark these places, for the earth herself covers them, leaving only whispers among the herdsmen. Beneath the oceans, too, the gates are said to rest. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, a vast terrace of stone whose steps and angles speak of deliberate craft. Some claim it is natural rock, others, that it is the remnant of a sunken city. But among the divers who descend into its depths, there are tales of arches, of doorways beneath the sea, too precise to be chance. The seaweed sways around them like curtains, the fish move in silence, yet the stones endure, as though the gate waits, drowned but not dead, for the day when the waters shall recede. In the deserts of Arabia, caravans whisper of ruins swallowed by shifting sands, pillars half buried, arches protruding like bones of the earth. When the wind howls across the dunes, some claim to hear a low hum, as if the stone itself still remembers. These tales speak of Iram of the Pillars, the lost city cursed for its pride. Perhaps it was not only pride that brought ruin, but the misuse of a gate, torn open without harmony. Now the sands guard it, covering the scar, leaving only silence. The mountains, too, conceal. In Tibet, hermits tell of valleys hidden beyond ridges of ice, where stone circles stand untouched by centuries. Some who wander there return with tales of lights that move against the sky, of doors that shimmer like mirages. Most never return at all. The monks say these are the entrances to Shambhala, the hidden kingdom where the wisdom of the ancients is preserved. Whether Shambhala is myth or memory, its gates are spoken of as real thresholds, unseen except by those whom destiny permits. Thus the earth is a great crypt of gates, scattered and sleeping. Some lie in plain sight, mistaken for ruins or carvings without meaning. Others are buried so deep that only tremors hint at their presence. Still others have been drowned by seas, their stones cloaked in silence. And yet, all endure. For though the ages bury, they do not destroy. The watchers knew this. That is why they scattered their fragments across the world, not only to preserve knowledge but to mark where the sleeping gates lie. The fragments are keys, but also maps, pointing to deserts, jungles, mountains, and seas. To read them requires wisdom, patience, and reverence. For the gates are not treasure to be seized, but thresholds to be approached in harmony with the cosmos. One day, when the silence ends, these sleeping gates will awaken. The stones will stir, the symbols will blaze, and the earth herself will tremble as the arches once more blaze with the breath of stars. And mankind, whether ready or unready, shall stand before them as their ancestors once did. Trembling at the edge of the unknown, for the gates have not vanished. They are only asleep, waiting beneath the earth, their slumber long but not eternal. If the gates lie sleeping beneath earth and sea, it follows that they are not forever beyond reach. For the ancients spoke not only of their form but of their awakening. They whispered of keys, not keys of iron or bronze, but of harmony, sound, and light. The gates, they said, are alive, and what lives may be stirred when the right song is sung, the right measure struck, the right harmony breathed across stone. In Sumer, the priests of Eridu spoke of sacred names, syllables which when uttered with precision caused the air to tremble. These were not incantations of superstition, but resonances, vibrations that matched the pulse of the universe. Upon the clay tablets, scattered like broken bones, remain fragments of these words. They speak of me, divine decrees, patterns of order that bound heaven and earth. To pronounce them rightly was to align with the law of the cosmos, to misuse them was to unleash chaos. Perhaps the me were not only laws but frequencies, tones that, when uttered, stirred the sleeping thresholds. In Egypt, the priests guarded hymns to Ra, sung at dawn as the sun rose. The hymns were intoned with such precision that each vowel length, each note, each breath was bound to cosmic measure. To outsiders it seemed but devotion, but within the sanctuaries it was known that these chants echoed the very resonance by which the sun god passed through his gates each day. Even the walls of the temples, shaped with care, resonated when the chants were sung, amplifying their power until the very stones hummed. What if these chambers were not only houses of worship, but instruments tuned to the hidden gates? In Bharat, the mantras of the Vedas are said to be eternal sounds, uncreated, existing before the world itself. The syllable Om is the seed of all, the vibration of creation. To chant it is to align with the pulse of Brahman, the cosmic breath. The yogis spoke of sound as doorway, of chakras as gates within, each opened by resonance. Perhaps these were not only metaphors of the body, but reflections of gates without. The resonance that stirred the soul might also stir the stones, awakening thresholds that sleep beneath the earth. Among the Maya, the drums and conch shells played in rituals were not random music but cosmic calls, echoing the cycles of Sun and Venus. Their pyramids, steeped in silence, thundered with sound when struck, amplifying the beat until it shook the body itself. The chants spoken at their summits were timed to celestial events. As though the sound and the stars together might awaken doors unseen, the Norse spoke of the Gjallarhorn, the great horn of Heimdall, which would sound at Ragnarok to open the bridge between worlds. To modern ears it is but myth, yet the theme endures, that sound awakens gates, that resonance is the key. Even in later ages, the echo persists. The builders of Gothic cathedrals shaped their halls to magnify chant, to stir stone into song. The rose windows shone with light, but the vaulted ceilings resounded with harmony, as though the churches themselves were instruments, veiled replicas of the older temples. The alchemists spoke in riddles of the music of the spheres, of tones unheard by mortal ears that guided the soul through transformation. The keys were not only sound, but also light. In Egypt, shafts within the pyramids aligned to Sirius and Orion, carrying starlight into the heart of stone. In Ireland, at Newgrange, the winter solstice sun enters a chamber and illuminates carvings of spirals, as though awakening the sleeping gate once each year. In Angkor, the rising sun crowns towers aligned in perfect geometry, a flood of gold that ignites stone. These alignments were not accident, but deliberate. Light itself was a key, striking the gates at appointed times, stirring them like strings of a great cosmic harp. The third key was geometry. The ancients inscribed circles, spirals, and stars upon their gates, not as ornament but as function. These symbols were patterns of resonance, blueprints of harmony. The mandalas of India, the labyrinths of Europe, the petroglyphs of the Americas, all echo the same forms, repeating across continents as though drawn from one source. To stand within such a pattern, to chant the syllables, to align with the stars, was to weave sound, light, and form into one, and in that harmony the gate would stir. Thus the ancients taught that the gates were not forced open by strength, but awakened by resonance. They were alive, and like any living thing, they answered not to violence but to harmony. To awaken them without reverence was to tear the veil and invite ruin. To awaken them rightly was to walk between worlds as one who is welcomed, not as one who breaks and enters. Fragments of this truth linger still. Modern seekers who wander among ancient stones sometimes hear hums without source, or feel vibrations that stir the bones. Instruments detect anomalies, magnetic fields that twist strangely, sounds beyond hearing. Scholars dismiss them as quirks of geology, but the patterns align too neatly with myth. The earth itself remembers. The watchers, knowing this, scattered the keys as they did the fragments. Some guarded chants, others guarded symbols, others guarded alignments of stone. No one order bore the whole, lest the unworthy force the gates awake. Only when the fragments are gathered in harmony, sound, light, form, can the gates stir without ruin. And so they wait, the keys hidden in chants and carvings, in shafts of light and measures of stone. To most they are superstition, but to those who see, they are fragments of a great design. One day, when the fragments are woven, when resonance is restored, the gates will answer. They will blaze not with ruin but with the breath of the cosmos, welcoming those who come in harmony. The ancients knew this, and they left the memory as warning and as promise. For the keys of resonance are eternal, waiting only for the hand that can play them with wisdom. The silence of the ages was never perfect, for men, restless and unyielding, could not help but reach toward what had been veiled. In every age there were those who, having gathered fragments of sound, light, and form, sought to force the gates awake. Their efforts rarely ended in blessing, more often they birthed ruin, for the gates are not instruments to be commanded but beings to be courted, and they respond only in harmony. Yet the chronicles of the world bear traces of these forbidden attempts, recorded as myth, as miracle, or as calamity. In Mesopotamia, after the age of flood, kings sought again to claim the heavens. The ziggurats they raised were not only temples but towers aligned with stars. Each tier mirrored the heavens, each stair ascending toward the sky. Among them was one tower greater than all others, whose builders declared they would reach the throne of the gods. The tale remembers this as Babel, a tower struck down by the divine hand, its builders scattered. But perhaps the tale cloaks a deeper truth, that the tower was no mere monument but an attempt to reactivate a gate, to rebuild with fragments what had once been whole. The scattering of tongues may not have been only metaphor but the deliberate breaking of knowledge, shattered so no one people might again misuse the keys. Egypt, too, bore traces of forbidden attempts. In later dynasties, when the wisdom of the first time had waned, priests sought to awaken what had fallen silent. Rituals grew darker, blood replacing song, sacrifice replacing harmony. Temples resounded with chants no longer tuned to the cosmos but to ambition. Legends tell of pharaohs who sought immortality not through the weighing of the heart but through passage into the imperishable stars. Yet the pyramids remained silent, the shafts dark, and the gates unopened. Perhaps they could not be forced, or perhaps the gods themselves had sealed them against such arrogance. In Bharat, the wars of the Mahabharata are remembered as battles of kings, yet the weapons described defy mortal forge. Blazing shafts that split the sky, thunderbolts that scorched cities, fire that lingered in ashes for years, these resemble not arrows but forces unleashed by tampering with powers too great for men. Some verses hint that these weapons were gifts of gods, entrusted only to the worthy, but misused by ambition. Others suggest they were awakenings of gates themselves, torn open in war, their unleashed energy burning the world. Whether weapon or gate, the ruin was the same, devastation beyond measure, followed by silence. The Greeks, inheritors of fragments from Egypt and the East, wove their forbidden attempts into myth. The tale of Icarus speaks of wings that reached too high, falling in ruin when harmony was lost. The tale of Phaeton tells of a mortal who seized the chariot of the sun, scorched the earth, and was cast down by thunder. These are not idle fables, but allegories of mankind's repeated trespass into realms not his own, of attempts to wield power beyond measure, ending in catastrophe. Across the ocean, in the lands of the Maya and Aztec, blood ran in rivers upon temple steps. Priests claimed the sun required nourishment, that only sacrifice could sustain the cosmos. But beneath this terror may lie a memory of broken attempts to stir the gates. For their temples, aligned with the heavens, were instruments of resonance. When used rightly, sound and light awaken harmony. When twisted into blood and fear, the gates responded not with blessing but with silence, or with forces too dark to control. Even in later ages, echoes of forbidden attempts endure. The alchemists of Europe, seekers of transformation, sometimes wrote of the tearing of the veil. A few spoke of lights that filled their chambers, of visions of cities not of this earth, of sounds that shook stone walls. Most perished in fire or madness, their writings fragmentary, their symbols darkened. They sought not gold but passage, yet without the fullness of the keys, their gates opened only for a breath, unleashing ruin upon themselves. In more recent centuries, tales arise of hidden laboratories where men of ambition sought to bend energy, sound, and light into forms unseen before. Some claim success, speaking of flashes of brilliance, of arches of fire that vanished in an instant. Yet such records are buried, dismissed as madness, or hidden by those who fear their consequences. Always the pattern is the same: fragments gathered, attempts made, ruin following. The gates are not toys of curiosity, they are thresholds of cosmos, and to touch them without reverence is to invite disaster. Thus the ancients warned, the gates cannot be forced. They are not machines to be activated, but harmonies to be invited. Their awakening is not conquest but communion. To misuse them is to unleash fire and flood, to bring ruin not only upon the seeker but upon the world. The forbidden attempts stand as scars upon history, remembered in myth as punishment. In scripture as wrath, in ruins as mystery, and yet, the yearning endures. Even after fire, even after silence, men still seek. For within mankind burns a restlessness, a hunger for the beyond. This hunger is both gift and peril. It drives discovery, but it also tempts arrogance. The gates, patient and eternal, wait for mankind to approach not with pride but with humility, not with greed but with harmony. Until then, the forbidden attempts shall serve as warning, that power without wisdom is ruin, and that the gates open only for those who walk in reverence. The Watchers knew this. That is why they scattered the fragments, why they veiled the knowledge. Not to deny mankind forever, but to protect them until the cycle is ripe. The gates cannot be lost, for they are woven into earth and sky. They cannot be forced, for they are bound to harmony. They can only be awaited, with patience, with reverence, with the readiness of spirit. Thus the chronicles of forbidden attempts stand as grim reminders upon the scroll of time, scars upon the memory of earth. Yet they are not the end, but the prelude to a greater dawn. For ruin, too, is part of the cycle, clearing the ground for renewal. And one day, when mankind has learned, the gates will awaken not to punishment but to promise. Across the vellum of ages, after the forbidden attempts and the long recoil of silence, a quieter understanding took root like myrrh in dry soil, that the gates, though wedded to cosmic measure, are also mirrors of the pilgrim. When the fragments of resonance were scattered and the great instruments of stone fell mute, what remained was the human heart, which still remembered in faint pulses the cadence of the first dawn. From that remembrance arose a covenant, not written upon tablets or sealed with kings' rings, but breathed into rites of humility, patience, and measure. This was the covenant of harmony, diffuse as incense, unbounded by empire, and older than any law. In far isles, where monoliths greeted sun and storm, keepers who knew nothing of other continents nevertheless traced the same ascent, to live by tides, to plant by phases, to bear witness when the sky delivered its rare and royal convergences. They had no need of secret orders, for their covenant was the sea and the wind, their signatures were the swells, their lamps the constellations drifting like slow caravans through the night. Thus the covenant wore many clothes and spoke with many tongues, but everywhere it preserved a single posture, the posture of accord. A second article emerged among the crafts. For when the gates slept and temples fell, the cathedral of the world retreated into the hands. The masons who set their stones with a tolerance finer than a hair's breadth did not name the gates, yet their string and plumb repeated the older law that form must not defy the plumb line of heaven. The instrument makers who tuned their lutes to resting fifths and measured pipes by breath lengths repeated, in cedar and reed, the truth that sound is a ladder set between earth and sky. The glassmakers who learned to coax sand into clarity remembered in fire that light is a visitor who grants vision when honored and blinds when seized. In each craft, the covenant took humble shape, to work so that the work itself keeps time with the wider measure. A third article preserved the ethics of approach. The elders, whether in cloisters, courtyards, deserts, or terraces, taught that pride is a rust that eats the hinge of any door. The one who rushes, they said, arrives at ruin, the one who coerces himself into blindness, the one who bargains with gods finds only his own echo. But the one who attends, who cleanses the lens, who tunes the chamber, who waits upon the date appointed, this one discovers that the gate was never far, for the world itself is threshold when seen in its rightful scale. Thus patience became an instrument as necessary as stone, and humility a tool as keen as obsidian, from these scattered articles. The covenant produced a lineage of quiet experiments, not the hubristic rending of veils but the reverent rehearsal of forms. In some age now forgotten, keepers gathered beneath a dolmen at the end of winter and laid out a simple triad, a circle etched with chalk, a bowl of still water, and a line of seed grain oriented to the sun's return. They did not speak to command, they arranged to consent. As the first light entered the passage, the circle brightened, the water held a perfectly unbroken disk of gold, and the line of grain seemed to smolder as if endowed with breath. Nothing tore, nothing screamed, nothing burned. Yet for those present, the air changed weight, like a harp-string drawn to pitch. And the sense of two rooms adjoining, this world and another, became palpable. They did not step across, they learned how to stand at the seam without breaking it. Elsewhere, a choir of monks in a stone nave rehearsed a single tone at dawn for the span of a season, matching it to the day's slight drift in length. Their aim was not spectacle but fidelity. When at last the equinox arrived, their note and the nave discovered each other. The wall behind the altar vibrated in a silent shimmer, the lamp flame briefly steadied, and the dust in the light poured downward like fine rain. No star chariot descended, no city rose from the floor. Yet a threshold announced itself as surely as a scent announces the approach of rain. The covenant had not lifted the gate, it had lifted the veil that keeps the eyes from seeing the lintel, on windless nights in the high desert. Watchers placed polished basalt on white sand and waited for a single planet to climb the eastern rim. When its light touched the stone, a thin band of brightness ran the edges like a ring lit from within. The watchers made no proclamation. They recorded the hour, the angle, the temperature of air and stone, and taught the apprentices to feel the difference between mere optical play and the breath-like hush that accompanies true accord. This curriculum was not punctuated by triumphs, but by refinements. It trained not for power but for proportion, thus the covenant taught 4 measures: proportion, patience, purity of instrument, and purity of intention. Proportion kept forms obedient to the law of larger form. Patience kept time with the sky, refusing to yank at a door set to open with the year. Purity of instrument asked that chambers, lenses, voices, and numbers be clean of error, knowing a single grit of pride can shift a vast result. Purity of intention demanded that seekers ask not for advantage but for alignment, that they come empty-handed, for what is grasped too tightly cannot pass. When these 4 measures moved together, the invisible began to articulate itself in the visible with a precision the rash had never known. Across centuries and civilizations, isolated circles arrived at the same inference, that the gates are not events but relations, not intrusions but fulfillments, not exceptions to law but the flowering of law when the root, stem, leaf, and sun align. In such moments, reality does not break, it sings. There were epochs when the covenant narrowed, compressed by conquest or suspicion, and epochs when it ripened, nourished by peace and scholarly exchange. In one age of concord, merchants' routes braided seas into temporary unity, and instruments traveled with spices and song. A desert astrolabe met a riverine water clock, a temple's sunshaft met a scholar's lunar tables, and for a time the covenant stepped from craft into conversation. Then jealousy returned, borders hardened, libraries burned, and the covenant retreated again into the hands and breaths of the few. Yet it never vanished. It is difficult to erase a law that is also a melody. In certain seasons of the world, the covenant pressed upon the conscience of rulers. A king, long forgotten except by the wind, ordered his architects to raise a tower that would not pierce the sky but praise its measure. No idol crowned it, no throne lurked within. The tower's hollow core became a flute for the equinox wind, so that twice each year it played a single, pure note to the valley below. Children learn the valley's calendar by ear, farmers with their seeds when the tower sang. The king died and another king forgot, yet the tower continued, teaching by tone what scrolls could not, making of governance an apprenticeship in listening. A people who could hear their season lived, without naming it, inside the covenant of harmony. Elsewhere, the covenant found asylum among healers. Midwives carried wooden discs engraved with spirals, not as talismans but as reminders of breath. Physicians in whitewashed rooms placed bowls of water where light could rest between visits, instructing the ill to watch the small weather of the surface until the hearts beat and the tiny wind of the water read one another. It is no great leap to imagine that thresholds which answer to resonance also answer to mercy. Perhaps all true healing is a small gate, opening from pain into proportion. The covenant also spoke through refusal. In coastal caves where sea and stone contest each other, hermits erased their own footprints each morning, so that their presence would not burden the place they served. In mountain monasteries where snow preserved every trace, caretakers lifted their feet with care upon boards laid just for the season, lest careless impact fracture the quiet geometry they had nursed all winter. These gestures, ridiculous to the proud, rehearse the ethics of approach, for a threshold is a place where the smallest error becomes the largest echo. To some, these were rustic pieties; to the covenant, they were the grammar of a sentence that would one day be spoken again in stone and star. For there will come an hour, the elders taught without haste, when the galaxy's slow will brings our sun into accord with lights more ancient than our memory. When the moon's nodal whisper, the precession's ponderous drift, and the heartbeats of stones align, when the chords of earth and the chords of men's voices settle upon the same pitch, when the crystal bones of mountains and the liquid eyes of seas receive an untroubled ray, and when, at last, the sleeping gates feel themselves recognized. On that day, whether it rises within a century or 10,000 years, the covenant will be the difference between tremor and catastrophe, between a doorway and a wound. Those who have rehearsed humility will stand without clamor. Those who have rehearsed proportion will know which stones to rouse and which to spare. Those who have kept the instruments pure will recognize the note when it returns. Those who have kept intention clean will be permitted to remain and witness. The rest will feel the old terror, the reflex to seize, the ancient haste that calls fire. Thus the covenant is not ornament to the story of the gates, it is the story's hinge, and so, while empires count their coin and armies measure their spears, the covenant continues in quieter places, in an elder who teaches a child to sit still until the cricket becomes a cathedral, in a surveyor who refuses the easy angle and seeks the true, in a singer who declines applause to tune a note no ear will praise, in a lens polisher who accepts that a flaw invisible to the eye may be fatal to the light. Through such unremarkable obediences, a world practices for its own very old appointment. The watchers, who long ago scattered the fragments, entrusted them not to vaults but to ordinary devotions. The keys of resonance, the calendars of light, the geometries of alignment. These may reside in manuscripts and monuments, yet their meaning can be kept alive only in a people who have learned to move at heaven's pace. The covenant of harmony is thus not a text to be recited but a species of life to be lived. To live it is to set one's days to the long metronome of stars, to accept that a gate is not a prize but a responsibility, and to prepare for a visitation whose hour cannot be bribed. When the hour arrives, and it will, for the sky keeps promises more faithfully than kings, the gate that answers will not be the only one. For thresholds, like notes in a chord, prefer company. A desert arch will awaken in the same dawn that brings a river's circle to life, a seafloor lintel will remember itself as a mountain ring thrums, a chamber beneath a city will stir when a forgotten ridge hums in snowlight. Then the world will discover that the covenant never guarded a single door, but the world door itself, paneled in continents, hinged on tides, and framed by constellations. To step carelessly then would be to rend the veil of the world, to step in accord would be to find the world flowering into its own next truth. Thus the covenant holds vigil, not to keep men out but to keep the song in tune. And as the vigil lengthens and the ages roll, the melody grows clearer to those who care to hear. The gates are not lost, they are rehearsing. The cosmos is not mute, it is counting in measures older than language. The earth is not passive, she is a musician whose instrument is her own body of stone and water. And mankind, if it will remember its place in the ensemble, may yet take up the old theme without shattering it. Until that day, the covenant moves as it has always moved, hand to hand, breath to breath, star to stone, silence to silence, preparing the thresholds to be found worthy of their own awakening. The ancients, who measured not only the heavens but also the pulse beneath their feet, knew that the gates were never placed at random. They were not scattered like seeds on stony ground, but planted with precision upon the hidden veins of the world. For the earth is not inert stone but a living body, whose mountains are bones, whose rivers are blood, whose winds are breath, whose fire is heart. Along her surface and beneath her skin run channels of unseen force, lines of tension and release, of attraction and repulsion, binding continent to continent and ocean to ocean in a web too vast for human eyes to grasp. These were the veins of the earth, and where they crossed in harmony, the gates were set. In the oldest maps, not maps of coastlines and kingdoms, but maps carved in rock, scratched into bone, or painted upon cavern walls, spirals and lines stretch across landscapes like the tracery of roots. Later generations called them ley lines, dragon paths, or song lines. The names differed, but the essence was the same. They were threads of subtle power woven through the fabric of the world. The ancients walked them in pilgrimage, following paths where song carried farther, where wells were sweeter, where air trembled as though charged by unseen fire. Along these lines they built their circles of stone, their pyramids, their temples, not as random shrines but as markers of the world's hidden anatomy. Consider Stonehenge, aligned with solstices but also linked across miles to other circles, mounds, and avenues, as though part of a greater pattern traced upon the land. Consider the Great Pyramid, whose vast mass anchors the Nile's floodplain and mirrors in stone the constellation of Orion, standing upon a junction of forces that stretch across desert and sea. Consider the temples of Angkor, scattered through jungle yet aligned to form mandalas that mirror the sky. Each is a note in a greater chord, struck where Earth's veins converge. The shamans of the Americas sang of these paths as the songs of the land. They taught that to walk them rightly was to keep the world in balance, that every step was a verse in an endless hymn between earth and sky. To the untrained, they were invisible. To the initiate, they were rivers of fire flowing beneath the soil, rivers that could heal or destroy depending on how they were crossed. In China, the geomancers named them dragon veins. They traced them with compasses of bronze, measuring how qi, the breath of the world, moved through mountains and rivers. Upon their junctions they built cities, palaces, and tombs, knowing that harmony with the earth's flow brought prosperity, while defiance brought ruin. The forbidden city itself rests upon such veins, a throne seated upon the back of a dragon. Yet beneath these pragmatic uses lurked the older truth, that the veins are not merely fortunes of men, but currents that sustain the gates, for the gates themselves, though silent, still pulse faintly in rhythm with the veins. When the earth trembles, when volcanoes roar, when auroras dance across polar skies, it is as though the body of the world is adjusting its own chords, reminding all who dwell upon it that the song has not ceased. And when the stars above align with these currents below, when heaven and earth breathe in unison, the gates stir, humming faintly with a resonance older than civilization. The watchers knew this, and they placed their markers accordingly. They raised circles where lines converged, temples where power flowed, obelisks where energy rose like smoke. These markers were not only monuments but instruments, tuning the earth to heaven, harmonizing the flow so that the gates might awaken without tearing. Without them, the power of the veins might surge wildly, unleashing storms, quakes, or fires. With them, the flow was guided, measured, prepared. Even the myths of serpents, so common across cultures, may reflect these truths. In Mesoamerica, the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl carried wisdom along hidden paths. In India, the serpent Ananta supports the cosmos, coils upon coils. In Norse lands, Jormungandr encircles the world beneath the sea. These are not merely symbols of chaos but memories of the veins themselves, vast serpents of energy winding unseen through the body of the world. Where their coils met, the ancients set their gates, for there the passage between worlds was thinnest. The covenant of harmony taught that to use these veins rightly was to live in accord with the cosmos. To abuse them was to call calamity. There are tales of kingdoms that prospered for centuries, nourished by the careful tending of their dragon lines, only to collapse when pride drove rulers to build against the flow. Temples sank, fields withered, skies darkened, not by wrath of gods but by the turning of veins offended. For the earth, too, demands reverence, and her hidden body is not to be bruised by ambition. In our own age, though the language is new, the patterns endure. Scientists measure magnetic anomalies, electrical currents, seismic pulses, gravitational whispers. They find that certain places defy explanation, regions where compasses falter, where animals gather, where the sky burns brighter with auroras, where stone hums faintly under instruments. They call them anomalies. The ancients called them gates. Both speak of the same truth, that the earth is alive with lines of unseen force, and that these lines, woven with the stars above, are the loom upon which the fabric of the gates is stretched. The web of power is thus not a relic of myth but a structure still present, waiting, resonating. To walk upon it without knowledge is to stumble through a song without hearing the tune. To live in accord with it is to stand at the edge of eternity, aware that beneath each step flows the current of the cosmos itself. The ancients walked these lines in pilgrimage, their chants carrying across valleys as if borne by the earth itself. They marked the nodes with stones and circles, not to worship the stones but to honor the currents. And when they reached the nodes, they stood with humility, knowing that they stood upon the very veins of the world, where heaven and earth brushed close. Where the sleeping gates still dreamed in silence. Thus, the gates are not isolated wonders but organs of a larger body, placed with precision upon the web of power. And until the web is understood, the gates cannot be awakened. For they are not doors apart, but doors within the living architecture of the world, each note in a song sung by mountains, seas, stars, and men alike, after the builders and the watchers, after the covenant and the web of power, there arose a quieter lineage whose labor did not heave stones nor stir choirs, but counted patiently what the heavens and the earth were already saying. These were the cartographers of silence, keepers of measures and memory, who believed that when a world forgets the names of its doors, the way back is through number, interval, and patient record. They did not command thresholds, they conserved the grammar by which thresholds might someday be addressed without offense. Their instruments were modest, chords knotted to constant spans, rods of cedar straightened by fire, bowls that gathered light, water clocks trained to the pulse of a drop, shadow gauges that taught the sun's handwriting to stone. Where others sought visions, they sought invariance, where others craved portent, they preferred pattern. They did not deny wonder, they domesticated it, giving it scales and ledgers so that generations not yet born could inherit a cadence unbroken by caprice. On wind-carved headlands they planted gnomons and read the year by a shadow's slow pilgrimage, engraving each solstice as reach into ledges so that stone would remember when men forgot. In courtyard observatories they taught the sky to compose itself upon tiled floors, marking the visitations of Venus, the sulks of Mars, the hermit cycles of Saturn whose patience outlasts a dynasty. They charted the nodal seesaw of the moon, learning that the sea's breathing includes a quieter countermelody only the careful can hear. They counted eclipses until terror became timetable, until dread could kneel without superstition before the choral logic of syzygy. They fashioned measures faithful enough to be ferried through time without mutation. From chalk downs and western isles there drifted a span, neither cubit nor yard of a later crown, by which circles were set so that arc and chord conversed with a civility fit for the sky. On desert plateaus surveyors unfolded triangles across miles as if sewing a lattice upon the hide of the earth, so that temples 5 horizons apart could speak a single geometric sentence. Along the river bends of Kemet, cords stretched between pegs rehearsed the theorem old as breath, not as scholastic sport but as obedience to proportion, for a gate's circle tolerates no boastful ellipse. In cities of dust and palm, water clocks learn to keep a second conscience, receiving at intervals a correction from the stars, for the cartographers knew that instruments left to themselves drift into flattery. In cloisters of snow and slate, monks beat time against the deafness of winter, inventing the discipline of hours not to enslave the day but to persuade it into clarity, and when the equinox came, their bells agreed with the horizon without argument. In river kingdoms, bronze armillary spheres spun as models of consent, Earth's tilt, Sun's dignity, Moon's reluctance, the planetary caravan all proceeding without collision because proportion had been loved to the point of imitation. Their houses of learning rose and were ash. A library by the sea drank the harvest of centuries and then, ruined by heat and steel, poured its memory back into the wind, yet not all was lost, for the cartographers had a second library in their minds. They walked among colonnades reciting catalogues where numbers nested in stories, where star names slept in corridors of verse, where tables of rising and setting wore the faces of heroes and grains and rivers so that children's tongues could carry what papyrus could not protect. In a monastery of the northern edge, scripts copied by candle rethreaded the world's broken loom. In a university of gardens and canals, algebra entered as a guest and stayed to teach the patience of unknowns. In a forest of stupas, a fire fell upon a store of wisdom, and still the cartography persisted because disciples had already transcribed the constellations onto breath. They learned to distrust conquest disguised as curiosity. They had seen kings demand a calendar that would clasp victory to an auspicious hour, they had watched princes bend the ephemerides to flatter a coronation, they had heard merchants insist that the moon's ledger be altered to ripen debts sooner. Against all such insolence they set the obstinacy of measure. A gate, they knew, answers only to a world that answers to itself. Therefore the cartographers defended the dignity of cycles, even when their patrons demanded theater. In their annals are entries that read like refusals, clouded, no observation taken. War smoke, no horizon. Famine, clocks stop to feed children. These lines are part of the covenant too. For to refuse false data is a confession that truth is not for hire, they apprenticed their senses to thresholds they could name. The first threshold was dawn, the exact breath when black dilates into blue. The second was meridian, the vertical silence when all shadows are shortest and the earth's spine feels a finger of light. The third was the heave of tide, the gate underfoot, rolling its slow syllable across shores, watched by rods planted among barnacles and by charcoal notches carved into wharf piles. The fourth was the pole's patient precession, a gate whose hinge turns more slowly than empires fall, requiring a fraternity that thinks across grandfathers. By serving these four, the cartographers rehearsed the unnameable fifth, the one where stones remember to sing. When the web of power trembled, they heard it sooner than their neighbors, not because they were prophets but because their ledgers taught them the difference between anomaly and omen. A year when solstice shadow missed its chiseled mark by the width of a seed, a season when aurora bled south into latitudes it had not visited in a century, a quiet excess in the tide's reach against known winds, such deviations they recorded without panic and with reverence, for every departure is also instruction. In a plain where standing stones fell without storm, the cartographers measured the manner of their ruin, which lintel cracked, which tenon slipped, which footing sank. They noted that the fractures favored a bearing already written in the country's oldest ridge. Thus even collapse, when read, became cartography. Their ethics were austere and luminous. They held that to measure is to pledge oneself to the thing measured, that the sky will not be faithful to the treacherous, that the earth attends to those who attend to her, that a false digit is a small betrayal with a long echo. They taught their apprentices to wash their instruments as if washing the feet of a guest, to anchor their tripods as if anchoring a vow, to recite their uncertainties aloud so that pride would not ossify into doctrine. They loved correction more than praise, solitude more than spectacle, and the long fidelity by which a civilization earns back a trust that myth once squandered. Where the watchers guarded fragments, the cartographers guarded continuity. They refused the fever of novelty, preferring instead the slow, generous arithmetic by which incomparable things compare, a shadow with a wind, a star with a seed, a bell with a tide, a mantra with a beam of solstice light. Out of such pairings they restored, plank by plank, a bridge cognition can walk when ecstasy is denied. They believed this bridge would be needed on the day when the world must cross without panic from what it thinks it knows to what it once knew in the marrow. They did not speak of stargates as talismans or thrones. They spoke of tolerances. How wide may a lintel drift from true before the chord refuses to speak? How long may a chant err before the chamber forgets its part? How far may a calendar slip before the appointed dawn strikes an empty aisle? For they had learned that catastrophe begins in tolerances ignored. And that renewal begins where tolerances are loved. In their glossaries, under gate, one finds a relation whose health depends upon precise kindness. And so the cartographers of silence walked the edges of empire like caretakers of an orchard they did not own but could not abandon. They watered stones with attention. They pruned calendars with patience. They grafted tables upon tables so that fruit would come even after winters without books. They taught that the world, properly praised, praises back. And though their names seldom grace the pediments of triumph, the day of awakening, whenever it comes, will lean upon their ledgers as a sailor leans upon a sextant that has never lied. For when the appointed concord arrives, it will not arrive as spectacle alone but as a sum of faithful habits, a door finding itself aligned because 1,000 unnoticed hands refuse to cheat the inch, the minute, the bar of song. Then the stones will feel themselves recognized, the chambers will remember their overtone, the shafts will open their throats to starlight without strain, and the world will know that between arrogance and adoration there has always been a third path, attention. Thus continues the chronicle, not with trumpet or thunder, but with the measured scratch of a stylus upon a wax tablet, entering the angle of a shadow at noon, preserving the difference between almost and exact. Against the day when almost would be too far to cross, in every age where memory thinned and silence deepened, there arose not only those who tended truth but also those who forged its likeness. For as the world forgot the true thresholds, men of ambition shaped substitutes, false gates fashioned of stone or word, raised not to harmony but to dominion. These were not the living arches of resonance but hollow imitations, monuments to pride disguised as promise. And though their forms mimicked the true, their hearts were void, for no chord of heaven ever answered to their call. The first of these false gates were towers. Long after the flood, when men sought again to bind heaven to earth, they piled bricks into ziggurats that clawed at the sky. Their peaks carried temples, their stairways ascended like ladders of gods. Yet though they bore the likeness of mountains, they lacked the measure of mountains, for they were raised by human haste rather than cosmic accord. The tale of Babel remembers one such tower, pride rising as stone, confusion falling as language. The builders sought a gate but received only scattering, for the resonance of ambition breaks harmony as surely as a cracked string ruins a lyre. Later, false gates took subtler forms. In Egypt, when dynasties weakened and priesthoods fell to rivalry, temples multiplied not as instruments of alignment but as trophies of cities. The sacred chants thinned into rote, the stones lost their tuning, the shafts no longer welcomed starlight with precision. Yet still the monuments were raised, their facades inscribed with promises of eternity, their halls resounding with authority. The people bowed, but the gates remained silent. For the arch without resonance is but an idol, and the song without harmony is but noise. In the east, too, the shadow appeared. Among the dynasties of Bharat, kings built palaces aligned not to cycles but to their own reigns, forcing geometry to flatter thrones rather than to echo the cosmos. The yantras were copied as ornament, their meaning lost to those who carved them. Rituals once tuned to stellar harmonies became spectacles for crowds, emptied of their precise intervals. In time, the true gates withdrew further into slumber, veiled by the proliferation of their counterfeits. The Americas also knew this shadow. The great cities of the Maya, once sanctuaries of cycles, grew swollen with rulers who demanded blood to keep the sun alive. The pyramids became false gates of terror, fed not by resonance but by fear. The chants thundered still, but their harmony fractured, drowned beneath the cries of sacrifice. Thus the people sought passage not into accord but into dominion, and the true thresholds retreated, leaving only stone and shadow. The false gates did not always take form of stone. Sometimes they were woven from word and doctrine. In cloisters of later ages, preachers promised passage not through resonance but through obedience to creed, declaring that heaven could be seized by formula, that paradise could be secured by coin or by conquest. Yet no starlight entered their chambers, no true gate stirred at their proclamations. Their words echoed across centuries, shaping empires and crusades, but the silence of the thresholds remained unbroken. The shadow of false gates is thus the shadow of pride. Wherever rulers craved power, wherever priests traded harmony for influence, wherever seekers demanded shortcuts, there the imitation was raised. It is easier to build a tower than to wait upon the stars, easier to carve symbols than to tune them, easier to demand fear than to cultivate reverence. But the easier path leads not to passage, only to ruin disguised as triumph. The ancients left warnings of this shadow. The myths of fallen cities, Atlantis swallowed by sea, Babel scattered by tongue, Iram buried beneath sand, are not merely tales of divine punishment but memories of false gates collapsing beneath their own arrogance. The floods and fires that followed were less wrath than consequence, for the cosmos tolerates no discord in its song. To build without harmony is to build upon fracture. Sooner or later, the fracture consumes the work, yet though false gates failed, their ruins endured, confusing the generations that followed. Travelers beheld towers and circles, temples and pyramids, and believed they were witnesses to powers still alive. Some were inspired to reverence, others to ambition, but few could tell which arches were true and which were hollow. Thus confusion multiplied, the shadow lengthening, until even the memory of resonance was nearly extinguished. But the watchers, and later the cartographers, knew the difference. They taught their few apprentices that the true gates reveal themselves not by grandeur but by harmony. A stone may be small, a chant simple, a chamber modest, yet if aligned to the stars, to the earth's veins, and to the clean intention of the heart, it may stir with resonance. By contrast, a tower may pierce clouds, a temple may blaze with gold, a doctrine may command nations, yet if built without harmony, it is but a false gate, impressive in form but silent in soul. The shadow of false gates thus serves as both danger and teacher. It warns mankind of pride, of the ease with which form may be mistaken for essence. It reminds seekers that resonance cannot be feigned, that no stone nor chant nor creed is sufficient without the covenant of harmony. And it teaches that true passage is not a spectacle of power but an act of consent, a door that opens only to those who have first aligned themselves within. Therefore the chronicles of false gates, though filled with ruin, are not without purpose. They sharpen discernment, they chasten ambition, they preserve by contrast the meaning of the true. For the silence of the thresholds is less perilous than the noise of their counterfeits. And when the day comes that the gates awaken, those who have learned to distinguish shadow from substance will stand ready. While those who trusted only in spectacle will find themselves before arches that collapse like dust. After the seasons of false gates and the long patience of the cartographers, a quieter architecture gathered itself from scattered obediences, as dew gathers along a web before dawn. This was not a temple of marble nor a doctrine with seals of kings, but a sequence of acts so ordinary that empires could step over them without seeing. It was called by some the liturgy of reawakening, not because it coerced the thresholds to open, but because it taught the world to become recognizable to its own first music. Where the covenant of harmony was law and the web of power was anatomy, the liturgy was practice, daily, seasonal, generational, by which stones, waters, winds, and minds remembered their consonants. The liturgy began at scale smaller than ambition. Floors were swept before numbers were taken, for dust perturbs light the way haste perturbs measure. Wells were cleared before chants were taught, for a reflection taught patience more faithfully than a sermon. Instruments were tuned to silence before they were tuned to sound, so that what they were calibrated against was not opinion but the hush upon which all song is drawn. The elders taught that the world notices when approached without noise, that thresholds, like skittish animals, reveal themselves to careful hands more than to strong ones. The first movement of the liturgy concerned grounds. Fields long scoured by greed were given Sabbath years, terraces were repaired along their contour lines so rain would walk rather than run, hedgerows were returned to their corridors so winds could sift gentler over seed. Floodplains were unshackled from stone where such mercy could be afforded, so that rivers might practice their old curves in winter and tame their tempers in spring. For the veins of the earth cannot carry clear current through bruised tissue. Where grounds healed, old stones stopped cracking, wells stopped souring, winds recalibrated their reins, and the quiet geometry of a place, its unseen protractor of ridgeline and shadow, re-emerged. The second movement concerned hours. Bells, drums, or simple breaths counted the day at 6 stations: first light, zenith, decline, dusk, midnight, and the nameless hinge just before dawn when even cinders hold a dormant ember. At each station, the smallest act of fidelity was offered to calibration. At first light, a bowl was placed where a beam could rest; at zenith, a plumb was tested; at decline, a shadow was traced; at dusk, a minor chord was allowed to settle without resolution; at midnight, water clocks were listened to in case the drop had learned impatience; before dawn, doors were opened so the chamber could inhale a measure that did not belong to men. Hours became instruments. And in such time-keeping the day remembered that it is eldest of teachers. The third movement concerned forms. The circle returned where squares had been forced, not to banish the square but to seat it within a circumference large enough to forgive right angles. Spirals were inscribed where corridors collapsed into blind turns, so that motion could turn without resistance. Labyrinths were restored in cloister gardens not as puzzles but as walking metronomes for attention. Rooflines were softened to converse with slopes and prevailing winds, and thresholds were oriented so that the first step of entering met light rather than shadow, or shadow rather than glare, depending upon the latitude's counsel. The liturgy taught that form is a courtesy extended to the forces that bear it. And that courtesy is the mother of resonance. The fourth movement concerned tones. Not every voice was fit for every chamber, nor every chamber for every vowel. A discipline emerged from elder hints, that dawn favored open syllables, that noon endured the narrow, that dusk preferred the consonants that hush, that winter chambers asked for low overtones while summer stones carried the high. Rather than festivals of spectacle, small choirs rehearsed for the earth the way mariners rehearse knots, until the hands could tie them blind. Instruments were tuned to cycles instead of fashions. When equinox struck, a note was chosen; when solstice arrived, its octave was tested for fidelity. When eclipse threatened, silence itself was offered as a kind of chant. The fifth movement concerned lights. Torches were banished from shafts where smoke had blackened admonishing stone, mirrors and polished copper returned where fire had once usurped the part of star. Roof slits were reopened to the course of sun and moon, city lamps were hooded so that stars could speak to water again. On coasts, lanterns were curtained at midnight during the season of hatchlings; in mountain towns, festivals learned to invert their blaze, letting valleys go dark while peaks kept watch, teaching the eye to climb. The liturgy insisted that light is a guest with rank, to be seated according to precedence: first the star, then the sky's pale residue, then the lamp, if it must, at last. The sixth movement concerned names. Not the naming of conquest, where men affix their titles to features older than language, but the recalling of native syllables that fit a place as bark fits a tree. The elders observed that when a ridge is addressed by its right sound, wind answers with less turbulence; when a ford is called by its accurate inflection, river offers fewer treacheries; when a star is hailed by the name it wore in the dawn of the tongue, the night seems nearer. Names were not magic but manners, by which a world weary of mispronunciation might lower its guard. The seventh movement concerned threshold ethics. Places suspected to be sleeping gates were granted perimeters of mercy. Not as fortresses but as buffers where greed is inconvenienced. Roads were bent gently around them, markets were kept 2 fields away, harvests were gathered by hand rather than machine in their neighborhoods, stones were lifted with apology rather than ripped with glee. The liturgy taught that a threshold's first test is whether those who approach it have learned to govern appetite. A people unable to leave fruit upon the bough cannot be trusted with the fruit of stars. Out of these movements ripened calendars of readiness. They did not name dates but conditions. When sea winds hold steady from the north for 9 nights, and the ridge shadow lies by a hand's breadth farther west than last year, and the well returns the sun as a perfect circle after rain, and the choir's fifth does not beat against the nave, then place the stone bowl under the shaft and remain still until a shimmer like a bee's wing rests upon the surface. In high valleys, when the first and last snows take equal days to melt from the twin cirques, when the marmots enter and the swifts return on contiguous dawns, when the moon's low arc just clears the thorn tree, then draw silence to the ring and do not speak until the cloud that always forms at the eastern horn forgets to appear. These were recipes not for power but for recognition, by which earth and sky were allowed to find each other without interference. The liturgy of reawakening also repaired lineages. Apprenticeships were lengthened until skill sank from hand into marrow. Masters were required to confess their errors in public at the equinox. Rival houses exchanged instruments for a season so that each might learn the other's biases. Treatises were copied across languages to preserve measure from parochial pride. Children were taught to sit with elder stone for an afternoon without complaint before they were taught any chant, for a gate will not trust a mind that cannot dwell. Scholars were sent to sea to learn how horizon corrects arrogance. Sailors were sent to cloisters to learn how silence corrects haste. Somewhere, upon a promontory where ocean eats its vowels, the liturgy arranged a simple meeting. A monolith that had fallen long ago was lifted a hand's breadth, not to restore grandeur but to restore plumb. A slit was cleared through brush so the winter sun might touch a forgotten mark on a low slab. A small bell, unremarkable except to the hand that knew its temper, was hung from a cedar post. When the day appointed by anonymous calendars arrived, the sky gave a clear wind, the slab took the beam, the bell found a breath, and the old arch, though still sleeping, answered with a tremor too gentle to frighten, too exact to deny. No flame poured, no chariot appeared. The water in a nearby bowl drew a single, steady ring as if a fingertip had grazed its skin and then withdrew. This was counted not as miracle but as a syllable of pronunciation learned correctly after centuries of stammer. Elsewhere, Deep in a forest where moss keeps time more faithfully than clocks, the liturgy reduced itself to a single gesture. A path long widened by boots was narrowed again with stones so that feet would place themselves in a cadence fit for the slope. When storm came, the runoff braided softly instead of slashing. In the stillness that followed, owls returned. The elders noted the hour and wrote in their ledgers a plain sentence: "The place remembers itself when we remember ours." In such sentences, thresholds regained courage. The liturgy of reawakening also taught how to refuse. When a prince demanded spectacle, the keepers closed their doors. When merchants offered endowments in exchange for guarantees, the keepers declined and planted cabbages to feed their singers instead. When scholars pursued publication faster than verification, the keepers embargoed their own findings until another valley confirmed the same shimmer under another shaft. The world, overhearing such refusals, relearned that trust is built from abstentions as much as from acts. In seasons of plague or war, the liturgy did not vanish, it simplified. Bells counted the living instead of the hours, cords were offered in houses where breath labored, shafts were left covered to keep dust from sacred floors. When peace returned, the coverings were lifted and the dust explained its arithmetic to the light. At each recovery, the liturgy resumed not as if nothing had happened, but as if having learned the pain's measure it could now tune more kindly. Pain became a teacher of proportion, and proportion is a vestibule of every true gate. Gradually, without proclamation, the world altered its posture. Markets ended an hour earlier in spring to spare the swifts feeding. Merchants learned the cost of glare and paid to darken windows. Barges yielded certain nights to rivers so that stars could walk upon them as they did before lanterns. Laws admitted that hills are older than roads and allowed roads to bow. None of these acts opened a gate. All of them opened the possibility that a gate might one day recognize the world that tried to recognize it. The cartographers' ledgers began to show a pattern invisible to the impatient. Deviations at solstice diminished in long arcs, auroral curtains arrived nearer to their old latitudes, the error between calculated and observed lunar nodes shrank by hairsbreadths that only lifetimes could notice. Stone, water, wind, and light, once made strangers by centuries of extraction, remembered their grammar. The earth's breath grew less ragged. The sky's handwriting upon wells grew legible. And in a few secret places, the old overtone returned to chambers that had forgotten their own throats. Yet the liturgy warned against triumph. It taught that the first symptom of approaching accord is the return of counterfeits, for pride arrives at dawn and claims to have lifted the sun. Thus watchmen were placed not at the gates but at the thresholds of motive. They listened not for rumor of wonders but for the ancient rattling in the heart that precedes haste. When they heard it, they slowed the day, lengthened the silences, dimmed the lamps, and postponed experiments until the appetite passed. In this way the gates were protected from the old ruin, the eruption of will within the very hour set aside for consent, so the liturgy of reawakening did what no edict and no tower could do. It taught the world to become the invitation. It braided grounds, hours, forms, tones, lights, names, ethics, calendars, lineages, refusals, recoveries, and motives into a single, unremarkable fidelity that made catastrophe less likely and accord more audible. It did not promise passage, it promised readiness. It did not seek spectacle, it sought clarity. And clarity, once restored, is indistinguishable from mercy, on the day when the appointed chord is struck, not by men, but by the slow agreement of earth and sky. The liturgy will not be rendered obsolete. It will be fulfilled. For the gate that answers will answer the posture that kept vigil, and the first step taken through will be guided not by arrogance but by the muscle memory of a civilization that rehearsed for nothing except the right to stand still at the seam without breaking it. Until that day, the liturgy of reawakening turns like a mill whose wheels are the seasons, grinding pride into patience, noise into listening, and restless knowledge into quiet wisdom fit to be recognized by stone. The gates sleep, but the world, through its ordinary obediences, is learning to dream in their language again. After the long centuries wherein the liturgy of reawakening reshaped the patience of men and the measure of earth, there arose another order, not of builders nor cartographers, but of guardians whose task was subtler still. They were known in whispers as the custodians of the veil. Their work was not to construct nor to calculate, but to keep the balance between revelation and concealment. Ensuring that what had been painstakingly relearned would not be squandered in haste, the custodians did not dwell in cities. Their homes were along the borders, at river fords, on mountain passes, in deserts where the horizon disguised the nearness of thresholds. Their role was never announced, for announcement itself would have betrayed their charge. They carried no symbols, save for simple tokens carved with patterns of interwoven lines, a reminder that the veil itself was sacred, not merely what lay beyond it, for the ancients had learned, at great cost, that the opening of a gate too early was as destructive as its corruption by false builders. The floods and fires remembered in myth were not punishments but proofs, that an unveiled threshold, when greeted by unprepared hearts, spills devastation rather than blessing. Thus the custodians were charged with vigilance, not against enemies of flesh and sword, but against curiosity unripe, ambition untempered, hunger that mistook itself for readiness. They walked the thresholds not to open them but to guard their silence. At sacred wells where waters shimmered too brightly, they covered the surface with reeds, teaching that truth must be dimmed until eyes are strong enough to bear it. At ruined ziggurats where echoes still carried traces of the old harmonies, they sang off-key, so that the stones would refuse to awaken to unworthy hands. At mountain caverns whose mouths aligned with solstice dawn, they wove curtains of brush so that only those who already knew where to look could find them. Their task was paradox, to preserve mystery by hiding it in plain sight. The custodians knew that mankind's thirst for wonder was bottomless, yet often shallow. Kings demanded access to power, prophets clamored for visions, wanderers longed for signs. But the gates are not spectacles. They are covenants, and covenants demand reciprocity. The custodians therefore stood as mediators between man's impatience and the cosmos' slow turning, ensuring that harmony was not disturbed by reckless intrusion. Legends of veiled places echo this hidden order. In the highlands of the Celts, mists were said to conceal valleys where time itself ran differently. In the deserts of Arabia, tales spoke of Iram of the Pillars, a city vanished beneath sands, visible only to those whom heaven permitted. In the jungles of the Andes, there were rumors of doorways cut into cliff faces that seemed solid to most. Yet at certain hours glowed faintly like embers within stone. These were not fables of lost wealth but of veiled gates, guarded not by armies but by silence itself, and by those who knew how to tend silence. The custodians bore another charge, to weave forgetting. They understood that not all memory is safe. Where a ritual was found to stir resonance before its appointed season, they deliberately corrupted its lines, teaching later generations a version harmless in practice yet potent in symbol. Where maps pointed too precisely toward convergence sites, they altered distances, leaving gaps that only patience and reverence could bridge. Forgetting, in their craft, was not loss but mercy, for it shielded mankind from truths that would otherwise burn unready hearts. Their greatest skill was discernment, to know when to veil and when to unveil. They watched for signs, subtle and layered. If a community tended its wells with reverence, gave rest to its fields, honored the balance of light and dark in its festivals, then the custodians might whisper a fragment of truth, loosening the veil by a thread. If, however, they found arrogance, exploitation, or demand for spectacle, they thickened the veil, burying memory deeper still. Thus they were less teachers than midwives of timing, aligning humanity's approach with the slow measure of the heavens. The myths of forbidden knowledge are shadows of their labor. The tale of Prometheus, who brought fire unbidden, the myth of Pandora, whose curiosity unsealed sorrow, the story of Eden, where fruit was tasted before ripeness, all echo the warning that unveiling too soon is peril. Behind such tales stands the hand of the custodians, shaping narrative so that men would fear impatience as much as they craved wonder. Yet they did not despise mankind. Their work was not born of mistrust but of fidelity. They longed, as all seekers did, for the gates to awaken. But they knew the cost of haste. They loved humanity enough to restrain it, as one restrains a child from touching flame before understanding fire. Their veil was a gift, not a prison, their silence, a form of care. Among themselves they held a prophecy, whispered only at dawn in places where sky and earth kissed most clearly, that the day would come when veil and gate would align, when humanity's long apprenticeship under earth and sky would reach maturity. On that day, their charge would end, for the veil would no longer be needed. Until then, they bore the burden of secrecy, carrying both the treasure and the silence that protected it, and so the custodians of the veil walked history unseen. Their names were not recorded in chronicles, their deeds were disguised as accidents, as neglect, as chance. Yet without them, the gates might have stirred too soon, or been seized by pride, or been profaned by spectacle. Their hidden vigilance preserved the rhythm of waiting, teaching the world that mystery is as holy as revelation, and that sometimes the highest fidelity is not to open, but to guard, through ages of builders and watchers, cartographers and custodians, through false gates raised in pride and true harmonies guarded in silence. The story of the Stargates became less a tale of doors and more a mirror of mankind. For every threshold of stone, there was a threshold in the heart, for every covenant of measure, a covenant of intention. The ancients taught that the gates would never answer to conquest, nor to fear, nor to spectacle. They stir only when the world itself sings in tune, when rivers flow unpoisoned, when shadows fall true upon unbroken stones, when chants rise not for power but for reverence. The gates are not machines but mirrors, they reveal only what humanity has become, thus the mystery endures. Perhaps the true stargates were never meant to be monuments of stone, but moments of accord, where earth and sky, measure and mercy, knowledge and humility, breathe together as one. In such moments, a door may open, not to elsewhere, but to the deeper here, where the cosmos itself whispers that all things are joined. The legends do not say whether mankind ever passed through. Some claim that Atlantis fell because its people forced the gates before their time, others that the watchers still keep vigil, waiting for the song to be whole again. The cartographers wrote only, "When the world remembers itself, the doors will remember us," and so the story ends not with conquest, nor with ruin, but with waiting. The gates sleep still, hidden in stone and song, veiled by silence and guarded by patience. Yet they are not gone. For in every dawn shadow, in every well of starlight, in every chord sung truly, the resonance stirs. Perhaps one night, when mankind has learned harmony deeper than ambition, a shimmer will ripple across the waters. A stone will hum softly in its place, and the veil will part, not as spectacle, but as recognition. Until then, the mystery remains, as all true mysteries should, half forgotten, half remembered, wholly sacred.